Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your sources, your articles, your research, your notes, and we really dig deep to find the absolute most important, most surprising, and, well, most useful insights.
That's the goal.
Our goal is always to give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed on, a fascinating topic. And today we are doing a deep dive into a stack of material centered around a truly influential book, Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point.
That's right. And the sources we're looking at are pretty rich. They include bits directly from the tipping point itself, but also some of the specific research papers and historical accounts that the book actually references. It gives us a really solid base to understand the core idea here.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea. Maybe we can start with a real-world mystery that's right here in the sources. We're going back to New York City, the 1990s.
Yep.
Specifically, neighborhoods like Brownsville and East New York and Brooklyn, places that were, well, incredibly poor and really struggling at the time.
And struggling is almost an understatement. By the late 80s, early 90s, these areas were facing just epidemic levels of crime. We're talking, rampant violence, serious gang warfare, the drug trade just dominating the streets.
Wow.
The sources, they paint a really vivid picture. Streets becoming literal ghost towns after dark because people were just too afraid to go outside. Kids couldn't ride bikes. Older folks wouldn't sit on their stoops. Police radios, just overwhelmed with calls as soon as night fell. Every kind of violent crime you can imagine.
The numbers from back then are just staggering, aren't they? Like 1992 alone, New York City recorded over 2,100 murders and more than 626,000 serious crimes. It sounds like absolute chaos.
It really was a city under siege in many ways. And then something happened. Something completely unexpected, kind of defied all the conventional wisdom at the time.
What happened?
Around a specific point, sort of a mysterious point, the crime rate didn't just gradually get better, it plummeted.
Plummeted? Like how fast are we talking?
Dramatically fast.
Yeah.
In just 5 years, roughly 92 to 97, the murder rate fell over 64%.
Yeah. 64% in 5 years?
Yeah, and total serious crimes nearly halved. Those streets that were ghost towns, suddenly they were becoming vibrant communities again. There's a police inspector quoted in the source. He talks about how in the 80s and early 90s, the sound of rapid gunfire was common, like being in Vietnam, he said. And by the late 90s, that sound just gone.
That speed of change is incredible. And you said it was mysterious. Why? What do the sources say about why it happened so fast? Did they figure it out?
Well, that's the mystery, right? The usual explanations didn't really fit. Things like, oh, the economy got better, or the population got older. Those might explain a slow, gradual decline. But New York's economy was still pretty stagnant during those years.
Right.
And thanks to immigration, the population was actually getting younger, not older. So this wasn't some slow, proportional improvement based on the factors you'd expect. It was sudden, sharp. It behaved like something else entirely.
And that something else is really the core idea behind The Tipping Point, isn't it?
Precisely. The book's described here as a biography of an idea. And that idea, it's actually very simple at its core. The best way to understand these mysterious, rapid changes in everyday life, whether it's crime waves starting or stopping, fashion trends taking off, why some unknown book suddenly becomes a bestseller, how word of mouth works, or even the rise of things like teenage smoking, is to think of them as epidemics.
Like a virus spreading, that kind of epidemic.
Exactly like that. The premise is that ideas, products, messages, even behaviors can spread through a population just like viruses do. And the sources bring in a second key principle of epidemics, which is really central to the book. This often counterintuitive idea that little changes can somehow have huge effects. And these effects often happen very, very quickly.
That feels wrong, though, doesn't it? We usually expect, a big cause for a big effect, a small cause, a small effect, proportionality.
Right. Our intuition is totally wired for that linear relationship. But epidemics, they just don't work like that. They follow what's called a geometric progression.
Okay, a geometric progression. What does that mean practically?
Well, think about the analogy they use in the source material. It's this puzzle about folding a piece of paper. Imagine you have a huge sheet of paper, really big. You fold it in half. Then you fold it in half again. And you keep doing that, say, 50 times. How thick do you think that stack would be?
50 times? I don't know, maybe like a thick phone book or maybe a stack of textbooks this high.
That's what most people get. Something manageable, right? But the reality, if you could actually do it physically, it's just mind-blowing. After 50 folds, that stack of paper would be roughly the distance from the Earth to the sun.
Wait, what? The distance to the sun? From folding paper 50 times?
Yeah, that's not what I expected at all.
Not even close. And get this. folding it just one more time, the 51st fold would reach the sun and come back.
Wow!
That's the power of geometric progression. Doubling and doubling again. It's incredibly non-proportional.
Okay, I think I get it now. A tiny input, just one more fold, has this ridiculously huge output. And epidemics behave just like that. They don't spread by adding one person at a time. Nice and steady, linear. No, they double their reach, then double again, spreading through networks until they cover huge numbers of people, metaphorically speaking, in just a few steps.
So to really understand these social epidemics, we have to kind of let go of that expectation of proportionality.
We absolutely do. The sources argue we need to accept that sometimes dramatic, widespread changes can spring from really small, seemingly insignificant things. And those changes can happen with startling speed.
And that possibility of sudden rapid change, when a trend hits that critical point, that's the tipping point.
Yes, exactly. The tipping point is that magic moment, critical mass. It's the threshold, the boiling point, where a quiet trend suddenly just erupts.
Like water hitting 100 degrees Celsius.
Precisely. The sources mention the phrase itself actually came into use in the 70s in sociology, originally to describe white flight from urban neighborhoods.
How did that work? What was the tipping point there?
Well, sociologists observed that when the number of incoming minority residents in a neighborhood reached a certain point, let's say maybe 20%, just as an example, the neighborhood would often tip, meaning at that specific point, most of the remaining white residents would decide to leave, and they'd do it almost all at once. A sudden, rapid demographic shift.
So it wasn't just a slow trickle of people moving out over time. It was like a dam breaking once that threshold was hit.
Exactly. A sudden, nonlinear event. And we see this with other stuff, too, like technology adoption. The sources mention the fax machine. Sharp introduced a cheap one in '84, sold maybe 80,000 units that year. Sales grew, sure, but pretty slowly for the next 3 years.
Just a gradual build.
Right. But then, 1987, something tipped. Enough people finally had faxes that it suddenly made sense for everyone else to get one, too. You sort of had to have one to do business.
The network effect kicked in.
That was the tipping point for faxes. Sales exploded. 1 million machines sold that year. 2 million the year after. Cellular phones. Very similar pattern. They hit their tipping point around 1998. According to the sources.
So it's that moment where the curve stops being this gentle slope and just goes almost vertical. That's the tipping point.
That's it, in action.
And for you, listening to this deep dive, our mission here is really to unpack these core lessons from the material provided on the tipping point. We're going to explore the key principles, the examples that help us understand exactly how these social epidemics happen. Whether you're, preparing for something specific, maybe trying to understand a baffling trend you've seen, or maybe you're just really curious about how social change works. We hope to give you some powerful tools, some new ways to look at the world.
Yeah, we'll get into the specific factors, the rules that seem to govern these epidemics, the kinds of people who are absolutely essential for spreading them, what makes a message actually catch on, and how the environment, the context, plays a surprisingly huge role.
Okay, so how do we start to figure out why some things manage to tip into an epidemic, spread like crazy, while others just fizzle out? The sources lay out 3 basic rules. 3 fundamental principles that govern these social epidemics, much like, biological ones have their own dynamics.
Exactly. These 3 rules are the law of the few, the stickiness factor, and the power of context. Think of them as the essential ingredients, maybe. If you can understand how these 3 things work together, you can start to see why some ideas or products or behaviors spread like wildfire, and others just don't. These rules give us the framework for explaining those mysterious, sudden changes we see.
Let's dive into the first one then, the law of the few. So this idea argues that in any social epidemic, it's actually a tiny fraction of people doing most of the heavy lifting, right? It's not just about the message, but who is spreading it.
Absolutely critical. The sources identify 3 key types of people who make up this vital few. They call them connectors, mavens, and salesmen. Each one plays a really distinct, essential role in getting an idea to spread.
Okay, connectors first. These are the people with just extraordinary social networks, right? They seem to know everybody. They bridge different worlds, different groups.
Yeah, a classic illustration that really helps explain this is Stanley Milgram's famous 6 degrees of separation experiment from the 60s. You probably know the basics.
Send a letter across the country to a stranger, only passing it to people you know on a first-name basis.
Exactly. Starting with random people in, say, Omaha, trying to reach a specific stockbroker in Massachusetts. The rule was crucial. Only pass it to someone you know personally who you think might get it closer to the target.
And the famous result, the one everyone quotes, is that most letters got there in about 5 or 6 steps, 6 degrees of separation.
Right. But here's the really interesting part for understanding social epidemics, the bit that reveals the law of the few. Milgram looked closely at the paths the successful letters took, and he found that out of all the letters that actually reached that stockbroker, fully half of them were delivered to him by just 3 specific people.
Wait, really?
Uh,
Half, through just 3 individuals, even though they started all over the place.
exactly. A clothing merchant, Milgram, called Mr. Jacobs, and 2 other guys, Mr. Brown and Mr. Jones. It dramatically showed that in any social network, not all connections are created equal. Some people are just hyper-connected. They act like hubs or bridges, linking together groups that otherwise wouldn't connect.
And the sources mention acquaintance surveys that back this up, right? That some people just know vastly more people than average.
Yeah, when researchers ask people how many individuals they know, the range is huge. And in basically every social group, every profession, every community, you find a small percentage of people whose social circle is 4 or 5 times larger than the average person's. Those are your connectors.
The source gives a great real-world example, Lois Weisberg, who is Chicago's Commissioner of Cultural Affairs. Her background sounds incredibly diverse.
It really is. Ran a drama troupe, started an underground newspaper that brought together all sorts of different people, knows musicians, lawyers, politicians, artists, you name it, she probably knows someone in that world.
And her personality seems key. Friends talk about her having zero snobbery. She just finds everyone interesting. One friend says Lois is always telling her, "Oh, I've met the most wonderful person. You are going to love her." And it's totally genuine.
Yeah, another friend says Lois sees things in you that you don't even see in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's that intrinsic personality, the curiosity, the sociability, the confidence to just move easily between different social worlds that lets connectors like her build and maintain these massive networks that span tons of different subcultures.
This reminds me of the Paul Revere versus William Dawes story they mention, that classic contrast.
Perfect illustration. The night before the revolution starts, both men get the same urgent mission. Ride out from Boston, war in the countryside, the British are coming. Same message, same urgency, rode through many of the same towns.
But Revere's ride is legendary. It ignited the countryside, got the militias ready. Dawes' ride barely made a ripple.
And the source explains this difference through the law of the few. Paul Revere, he was a connector. He wasn't just some guy carrying a message, he was plugged in. An unofficial clearinghouse for the anti-British movement, a leader in the community. He knew everybody.
So when he rode into a town, he knew exactly whose door to bang on, who the local militia leader was, who the influential people were who could spread the word fast. He wasn't a stranger.
Precisely. He could blast that message out through his vast network, especially using what sociologists call weak ties, those acquaintances he had in different towns, different groups. Those weak ties are actually more valuable for spreading new information widely than just your close friends because they connect you to different worlds. Dawes. He was just an ordinary guy, didn't have that network density, that cross-group influence.
So connectors are powerful because they can spread information quickly across a really broad range of people and groups.
That's their superpower. And being connected to a connector, it doesn't just help people, it helps ideas and products too. The sources bring up the unexpected comeback of Hush Puppy shoes in the mid-90s. They went from basically zero, this old-fashioned shoe, to super trendy almost overnight. Conventional advertising couldn't explain that.
So the theory is some key connectors must have found them.
That's the likely explanation. Probably discovered by a few connectors hanging out in, say, the East Village, adopted by a few influential people there. And then, through those connectors, wide-reaching, weak ties connecting downtown New York to maybe college campuses, maybe even the suburbs, the shoes got sent in 1,000 directions at once. That's what likely caused that sudden explosion. The sources even suggest some fashion trends fail just because, by chance, they don't get picked up and validated by a connector early on.
Okay, so connectors are the networkers, spreading the message far and wide. That's the first type in the law of the few.
Right. But just spreading the word isn't enough, is it? The information itself has to be compelling, trustworthy. And that brings us to the second type, the mavens.
Maven, that's from Yiddish, right? Meaning someone who accumulates knowledge.
That's it. Mavens are the information specialists. They're the people we turn to for advice, for recommendations, for the inside scoop.
The supermarket example comes up again here for mavens, too.
It does. Remember how most shoppers don't really track prices closely? But there's that small group who do. The price vigilantes or market mavens, they're crucial. They notice if a sale isn't really a sale, they might complain. But more importantly, they tell their friends. Economists actually study them because they play this surprisingly big role in distributing information in the marketplace.
And the source gives this fantastic, really detailed example of a maven named Mark Alpert, a professor, right? His obsession with collecting information sounds almost extreme, remembering coffee prices from 10 years ago to the cent.
Yeah. But the key thing about a maven isn't just that they collect information, it's that they are driven, almost compelled, to share it. The source quotes research describing them. A maven is a person who has information on a lot of different products or prices or places. This person likes to initiate discussions with consumers and respond to requests. They're helpers in the marketplace. They'll give you coupons, explain how things work. They genuinely enjoy helping you find a good deal or make a smart choice.
So they're different from, say, an expert. An expert might talk about cars because they just love cars. A maven talks about cars because they love you and they want to help you get the right car.
Exactly. They're described as being more socially motivated. Their primary drive is to help other people by sharing what they've learned.
And Alpert's examples are so specific. He'll tell you exactly why he chose cable over dish, why Leonard Maltin's movie guide is the one to trust, how he snagged a $99 rate at a Manhattan hotel when the rack rate was $189, and he makes sure you know what a rack rate is.
His car buying advice is perfect. He knows exactly why you should steer clear of an Audi, Germans, pain to deal with, small dealer network, hard service, and why maybe you should look at a Mercury Mystique. Drives like a more expensive European sedan, they aren't selling well, get a good deal, go to the fleet buyer on the 25th of the month. He even talks about spending months researching TVs, buying and returning them until he found the absolute perfect one.
It sounds exhausting, but his goal is clearly getting the absolute best outcome based on all the data.
And then sharing that hard-won knowledge. He calls himself almost pathologically helpful. The source suggests a maven is maybe someone who wants to solve other people's problems, generally by solving his own. Or maybe they meet their own emotional needs by helping others. They're information brokers constantly sharing, trading knowledge.
And this seems like a really key distinction from the sources. Like, mavens aren't persuaders. They aren't trying to sell you something or twist your arm. Their motivation is just to educate and help.
And that's exactly where the third type of person in the law of the few comes in, the salesman. These are the people who have those subtle but really powerful skills to persuade us, which is absolutely critical when an epidemic needs people to actually do something, not just know something.
What makes a salesman so effective, then? Is it just being charismatic or smooth talking?
It's deeper than that, according to the sources. They get into studies on persuasion, and these studies show the huge importance of nonverbal cues. Often those cues are way more powerful than the actual words someone is saying.
Like body language.
Yeah, and even things we're barely aware of. There's this fascinating study mentioned where students listened to an editorial arguing for raising their university tuition, something that would cost them money. Half the students were told to subtly nod their heads while listening, the other half to subtly shake their heads. The students who nodded ended up agreeing with the editorial way more, even though it was against their financial interest. They didn't consciously think, oh, I'm nodding, so I must agree. The physical movement itself unconsciously swayed their opinion.
Wow. That's kind of unsettling, actually.
It is. Another example, a study suggesting subtle cues from newscasters could influence viewers. One analysis proposed Peter Jennings' slight smile when mentioning Ronald Reagan might have nudged ABC viewers towards Reagan, even though ABC's commentary was rated as the most hostile towards him. Tiny, maybe unconscious physical movements or expressions can profoundly affect how we feel and think, often without us realizing it.
This sounds related to that idea of synchrony they talk about.
Yes, exactly. The sources describe synchrony as this sort of super reflex, a basic physiological ability we have, but we're mostly unaware of it. It's how people naturally fall into physical and conversational harmony with each other, like an unconscious dance.
Like when you sit down with someone and you both end up leaning the same way or crossing your legs at the same time.
It's more than just simple mirroring, which can feel fake if you do it deliberately. It's a deeper resonance. They use the example of meeting this salesman, Tom Gao. The description is powerful how he created this bond through movements and speech patterns before the words even really registered. He created this compelling dance.
So part of being persuasive is having this knack for drawing people into your rhythm, setting the tempo of the interaction.
That seems to be a big part of it. Studies show students who achieve high synchrony with their teachers. They're happier, more enthusiastic about the class. With someone like Gao, the feeling described was being almost seduced into this synchrony. The conversation happens on his terms, which makes his message more compelling.
And then there's emotional contagion. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, this is a pretty radical idea they present, that emotion can actually flow outside in. We usually think of it as inside out, right? I feel happy, so I smile. But emotional contagion suggests the reverse can happen too. If I can somehow get you to smile physically, it can actually make you feel a bit happier. Maybe frown, maybe make you feel sadder.
And some people are just better at broadcasting their emotions.
Exactly. These are the people who are really good at expressing emotions and feelings non-verbally. It makes their emotions more contagious to people around them. Psychologists call them senders. It's not just acting. They often have distinct personalities. And some research even suggests physiological differences, like in their facial muscles, making them more expressive. It's compared to how some people are naturally better carriers for certain diseases.
Okay, so salesmen are the people who use these skills, subtle persuasion, creating synchrony, emotional contagion, to get us to actually act. They provide that crucial final push.
That really sums up the law of the few. You need the connectors to spread the message far and wide. You need the mavens to provide the credible, useful information. And you need the salesmen to persuade people to actually adopt the idea or behavior. But, like we said, who sprints the message isn't the whole story.
Right. The message itself has to stick. It has to be memorable enough, impactful enough to actually catch on and make a difference. And that brings us neatly to the second rule of epidemics, the stickiness factor.
Yeah, for an idea or a product or whatever to tip, it needs to be memorable. It has to make an impact. It needs to stick in our minds long enough to actually change us or spur us to action. Think back to Roger Horchow, the connector, faxing his friend about that restaurant. His network spread the word, sure, but for that restaurant epidemic to really take off, the restaurant itself had to be good. The experience had to be memorable, impactful. The content matters a lot.
So the message isn't just raw information. It needs to be packaged or presented in a way that it lodges itself in your brain and actually motivates you to do something.
Exactly. And the sources point to direct marketing as a field that's become incredibly good at engineering stickiness. Unlike, say, traditional brand advertisers who often rely on fuzzy ideas like humor or celebrity endorsements, direct marketers live and die by hard numbers. Coupon returns, calls to 800 numbers, click-throughs now. They test everything rigorously to find out what actually gets people to respond.
What's a good example of this kind of systematic approach to making something sticky?
The tetanus study they describe, conducted with Yale seniors, is a perfect illustration. Researchers gave students these booklets about the dangers of tetanus, why they should get inoculated. They tried different versions, one with really graphic, high-fear pictures of tetanus victims, another much milder. They emphasized the risks of not getting the shot.
So you'd think the scary version, the one really hammering the risks, would be the most effective, right? Scare them into action.
That was the logical assumption. But it turns out neither the level of fear nor just emphasizing the risks made much difference in how many students actually went to the campus health center to get the shot. Very few did, regardless of the booklet type.
That's really surprising. So what did work? What made it sticky?
The version of the booklet that simply added two small things: a map showing where the campus health center was, and the specific hours when shots were available.
That's it, just a map and the times? That seems so minor compared to, like, pictures of lockjaw.
And that's the core insight of the stickiness factor. It wasn't that the students didn't know tetanus was bad or weren't scared enough. They knew the risks. The problem was the message lacked practical personal instructions on how to take action, how to fit getting the shot into their actual lives. The map and the times. They made the abstract advice concrete, personal, actionable, and made the message sticky. The sources even note the students probably didn't even need the map. They were seniors. They knew the campus. But just having it there transformed the message from vague advice into a specific, doable task.
That really hammers home the point. Stickiness can be about tiny, practical details, not just big emotional pushes.
It really can. And the sources argue that today we've got this massive clutter problem. Just the sheer volume of information hitting us all the time makes achieving stickiness way harder than it used to be. They mention examples like Coca-Cola spending a fortune sponsoring the Olympics but getting really low recognition afterwards, or studies showing how 15-second ads basically lose all effectiveness when they're crammed into a break with lots of other ads. So much stuff just washes over us because it doesn't stick.
It's like trying to hang one more picture on a wall that's already completely covered in pictures. Yours just gets lost.
Exactly. But the good news is stickiness isn't just random luck. It can be systematically engineered. And maybe nobody mastered this better, especially for a really tough audience, than the creators of successful kids' educational TV. Specifically, Sesame Street, and later, Blue's Clues.
Oh, yeah, classics. How did they engineer stickiness?
Well, Sesame Street's whole goal from the start was explicitly to make educational stuff stick with young kids, especially kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. They used really innovative research tools, like the distractor. They'd show kids a potential segment, but put interesting toys nearby. And just watch how much attention do the kids actually pay to the screen versus the toys. The initial assumption was toys nearby, kids won't watch, won't learn.
But that wasn't what they found, was it?
No, it led to this really crucial insight. They found kids with toys nearby only watched maybe half the time, but they still remembered and understood just as much as the kids who didn't have toys.
Really?
And suggested kids weren't just passively zoning out, they were sophisticated, strategic viewers even at that age. They watched when they understood what was happening, and they looked away when they were confused or bored. This meant you could judge stickiness and learning just by carefully observing where kids' attention was focused.
And Ed Palmer, their research head, used this constantly to tweak the show, right?
Exactly. His research fed directly back to the producers. They learned all sorts of things. For instance, kids apparently hated segments about animals. They didn't get the puns in the Man from Alphabet character. Segments shouldn't be longer than about 4 minutes. And crucially, they found kids tuned out when adult characters were having loud arguments or talking over each other. The producers thought that created excitement, but the kids just saw confusion.
And confusion is the enemy of stickiness.
Totally. There's another example, Oscar's blending. They tried teaching letter blending with Oscar the Grouch doing his thing in the background. Oscar himself is super sticky, kids loved him. But his antics were so distracting that the lesson about blending didn't stick at all. Sesame Street's big contribution here was showing that careful, systematic attention to the structure and format of the content, based on real observation, could dramatically boost stickiness.
And then Blue's Clues came along and took it even further.
Yeah. The creators of Blue's Clues were definitely inspired by Sesame Street, but they wanted to push the stickiness idea more. They questioned Sesame Street's fast pace, its magazine format, with lots of short, unrelated segments. They believed preschoolers could actually focus for longer if the show was designed differently.
Right, so Blue's Clues went with that really deliberate pace, the single host, Steve, the single storyline per episode, those flat 2D visuals, the long pauses for kids to answer, the super simple naming mailbox is just mailbox.
Yeah, to an adult, it can feel almost painfully slow, maybe simplistic. But the sources explain why it was genius for its audience. Within months of debuting, Blue's Clues was beating Sesame Street in the ratings and scoring way higher on those attention tests.
Why did it work so much better?
Because it really got what preschoolers need. Their research showed something counterintuitive. For this age group, attention and comprehension didn't peak on the first viewing. They actually increased with repeated viewings over a week.
Wait, they understood more the 5th time they saw it than the first.
Exactly. Which is the opposite of older kids or adults who usually crave novelty. Preschoolers, it turns out, seek understanding and predictability. Repetition is comforting and valuable. Being able to predict what happens next. That feels like mastery, like power. For a little kid, it builds self-worth. And Blue's Clues actively invites participation. Steve is always asking questions, making kids feel like they're genuinely helping Steve solve the puzzle. That doubles the engagement.
So it's this clever balance, complex enough that you actually learn more when you rewatch it, but simple enough that it's not baffling the first time around.
And their research was incredibly thorough. They tested every single episode 3 times before it ever aired. The story they tell about testing a script where Steve has to find Blue's favorite animal perfectly shows how tiny changes engineer stickiness.
What happened in that test?
Well, the script involved finding 3 clues to guess Blue's favorite animal. In the first version of the script, the clues were presented in an order that let the kids guess very specific animals like beavers or worms pretty early on, which kind of killed the suspense.
Right, they solved it too quickly.
Exactly. But the researcher, Allison Sherman, she cleverly tweaked the order of the clues. By putting the broader clues first, the kids initially guessed all sorts of animals, dogs, cows, pandas. It kept the possibilities wide open.
Building the suspense.
Yes. Then, as the more specific clues came in like black and white lives on ice, the guesses narrowed down. The final clincher clue was waddle. And when that clue landed, you could see the kids' faces light up. They'd connect waddle to the other clues and shout, "It's a penguin! A penguin's black and white. It lives on the ice and it waddles." The show only works as this fun story of discovery if the clues are ordered just right to build that suspense and lead the child to the answer at the end.
So, a seemingly tiny change, just the order of the clues in the script, made a massive difference in whether the episode was sticky, whether it actually worked as an engaging experience for the kids.
It's a fantastic example of how stickiness can be engineered right down to the finest details and how absolutely crucial that engineering is for a message to actually land and be remembered.
Okay, so we've got the law of the few, the special people who spread the word. We've got the stickiness factor, what makes the message itself memorable and motivating. Now we get to the third fundamental rule, the power of context.
Right. And this principle basically says that epidemics are incredibly sensitive to the conditions, the circumstances, the environment where they happen. And just like the other rules, small changes in that context can have surprisingly large effects.
Let's circle back to our opening example, that dramatic drop in crime in New York City in the 90s. The sources really present this as a prime example of the power of context in action. We talked about how the usual explanations of the economy or demographics didn't really fit the suddenness of the drop.
Exactly. The sources point instead to the state of the New York subway system back in 1984 as a key contextual factor. It was pure chaos down there. Dimly lit platforms, literally every single car covered inside and out with graffiti, filth everywhere. Constant delays, fires on the tracks, derailments, trains crawling at slow speeds, massive fare beating costing the city maybe $150 million a year, thousands of felonies happen right on the trains and platforms, pervasive harassment, ridership had plummeted because it just felt unsafe and broken.
It sounds like a truly demoralizing, almost lawless environment.
And this is where the broken windows idea, as presented in the source material, comes in. This theory strongly influenced the police strategy at the time, which shifted focus towards order maintenance. The core idea is simple. If a window in a building is broken and nobody fixes it, it sends a signal that no one cares. And that signal encourages people to break more windows, maybe vandalize more, maybe commit more serious crimes. Small signs of disorder, graffiti, turnstile jumping, litter can signal a general breakdown of social rules, creating an environment that implicitly invites more serious crime.
So, when the police started cleaning up the graffiti, cracking down hard on fare beaters, dealing with those seemingly minor offenses, it wasn't just about those small crimes themselves, it was about changing the signal the environment was sending, changing the context.
That was precisely the idea, changing the context to signal that order was being restored, that someone was in charge, that rules mattered. And this view stands in a pretty stark contrast to how we often think about criminals psychologically, right? The common view often focuses on internal factors, maybe stunted development, bad parenting, genetic predispositions, inherent moral flaws. Think about the Bernie Goetz subway shooting. It's often analyzed through that lens, looking at Goetz's own internal issues or the backgrounds of the youth he shot.
The traditional view seems to assume people, including criminals, act mainly because of who they are, deep down their personality, their history, almost independent of their immediate surroundings.
But the radical idea put forward by the power of context is basically the opposite. It suggests that people, perhaps especially criminals, are acutely sensitive to their immediate environment, that their actions are often prompted or at least heavily influenced by their perception of the world around them right then and there. The source argues pretty strongly that the Goetz shooting had very little to do with the deep backgrounds or pathologies involved, and was instead strongly influenced by the specific context of that chaotic, threatening, seemingly rule-free subway car environment.
That really does challenge our usual ways of thinking about behavior and responsibility, doesn't it? Blaming the situation, not just the person.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And the sources bring in some really compelling psychological evidence to back up this idea that context can be a powerful, sometimes even overriding force.
Like the Stanford prison experiment. That one's pretty famous.
Yeah. Philip Zimbardo's 1971 experiment. He took psychologically normal college students, randomly assigned them to be either guards or prisoners in this mock prison he set up. Within just a few days, the guards started acting really sadistically, becoming aggressive and authoritarian. The prisoners became passive, depressed, emotionally distressed. It got so bad they had to shut the experiment down after only 6 days.
And the conclusion wasn't that they'd accidentally picked sadistic students to be guards?
No. The conclusion was that the situation, the powerful context of the roles and the environment they were put in, seemed to literally override their normal personalities and traits. As one prisoner reportedly said afterwards, his behavior felt less under his control than I realized. It wasn't about who they were inherently. It was about what the situation made them.
There's also that older research mentioned, the Hartshorn and May honesty tests from the 1920s.
Right, those were really extensive studies. They tested thousands of school children on honesty in all sorts of different situations. Could they cheat on an arithmetic test, a spelling test? Would they cheat in a game? Would they lie? Would they steal pennies left out? The findings were pretty surprising back then.
Because they found honesty wasn't this single fixed trait. Like, you're either honest or you're not.
Exactly. They found that a kid who cheated on the math test wouldn't necessarily cheat on the spelling test. A kid might cheat in a game, but be truthful when asked directly. Their honesty wasn't some fundamental, consistent trait. It was highly dependent on the specific situation they were in. Yet, as the sources point out, we still tend to talk about people in absolute terms. Oh, Howard is generous. Alice is really honest. We rarely qualify it. Howard is generous when he's at home, but maybe less so under pressure at work.
We don't naturally factor in the context when we describe personality.
And that tendency, that's a fundamental bias in how we perceive people. Psychology calls it the fundamental attribution error, or FAE. It's our ingrained habit of overestimating the importance of someone's basic character or disposition and underestimating the powerful influence of the situation or context they're in when we try to explain why they did something. We just prefer dispositional explanations. They did it because that's the kind of person they are, over contextual ones. They do it because of the situation they were in.
Like assuming the quiz show host is brilliant because they know all the answers, forgetting they were given the answers, or judging a basketball player's skill based on how they shoot in a badly lit gym versus a well-lit one.
Exactly. Those kinds of things. And the FAE pops up in everyday assumptions too, like the persistent belief that your birth order fundamentally shapes your personality. The source mentions Judith Harris's argument that those supposed birth order traits really only manifest strongly within the specific context of the family. Outside the family, in different situations, they're much less predictive.
It seems like our brains are wired to simplify things by putting people into neat boxes based on traits. A reducing valve, as one psychologist called it. But it means we distort how much context actually drives behavior.
And maybe the most striking demonstration of this power of context, the one that really hits home in the sources, is the Good Samaritan study. This was an experiment with seminarians at Princeton Theological Seminary. They were told they needed to go across campus to give a practice talk. Some of them were specifically assigned to talk about the biblical parable of the Good Samaritan. You know, the story about helping a stranger in need. On their way to give the talk, they encountered a person, actually part of the experiment, slumped in a doorway, coughing, groaning, clearly needing help.
Okay, so the obvious prediction is that the seminarians who were literally about to preach about compassion, or maybe those who said they entered the ministry specifically to help people, they'd be the most likely to stop, right?
That's what everyone predicts. But the study found something astonishing. Neither the topic of their talk, Good Samaritan or something else, nor their stated reasons for wanting to be ministers made any statistically significant difference in whether they stopped to help.
Wow. So what did make the difference then?
The only thing that had a major impact was whether the seminarian thought they were in a hurry to get to the talk.
Just whether they were running late, that was it.
That was pretty much it. Of the seminarians who were told they were late and needed to hurry, only 10% stopped to help the person in the doorway. But of those who were told they had plenty of time, 63% stopped.
That's a huge difference.
It's massive. The simple context of feeling rushed completely overrode their supposed moral inclinations, their professional calling, even the fact that they might have been actively thinking about the principle of helping others just moments before. It's a powerful, almost unsettling example of how much the situation can trump what we think of as core character or belief.
That really is a radical idea. It suggests we might be fundamentally misreading human behavior all the time, focusing too much on the person and not nearly enough on their surroundings.
And the power of context isn't just about physical places or immediate time pressure. The sources broaden this idea, talking about how social structures, even just the size of a group, can act as a critical contextual factor. This leads to this fascinating concept called the Rule of 150.
Ah, yes. This comes from the work of the anthropologist Robin Dunbar. He studied the link between brain size, specifically the neocortex, the thinking part of the brain, and the typical group size in different primate species.
Exactly. He found this really strong correlation across many primate species, and when he plugged the human neocortex size into his equation, the number it predicted for the maximum size of a social group where we can maintain genuine, stable social relationships where you actually know everyone, know who they are, know how they relate to everyone else, is around 150 people.
About 150, and beyond that.
Beyond that number, Dunbar argued, the nature of relationships changes. It becomes harder to maintain that kind of close-knit, informal social cohesion. You need more formal rules, structures, hierarchies to keep things functioning.
And the sources give this incredible real-world example that seems to have stumbled onto this number completely independently. The Hutterite colonies.
Yeah, these are agricultural communities, mostly in the northern U.S. plains and Canada. And for centuries, they followed this strict, traditional practice. Whenever one of their colonies grows to approach 150 people, they deliberately split it in two and start a new colony nearby. Their reasoning, recorded long before anyone heard of Dunbar, lines up perfectly with his number.
What is their reasoning? Why split at 150?
They believe, based on generations of experience, that keeping the group size under 150 is essential for everyone to stay knit together, for everyone to know everyone else, to share work and possessions effectively, to maintain community harmony through informal means. Bill Gross, a Hutterite leader quoted in the source, explains that once you get much bigger than 150, people start becoming strangers to each other. Cliques or clans form, and that close-knit fellowship starts to get lost.
So crossing that threshold, even by just a few people, fundamentally changes the social dynamics.
It does. They describe it as this indefinable but very real change in the nature of the community. Crossing that 150 line, a seemingly small numerical change, makes a huge negative difference in their ability to maintain social cohesion and manage things through peer pressure and shared understanding, rather than needing formal rules and bosses.
And this isn't just for, traditional religious communities. The sources bring up Gore Associates, the company famous for Gore-Tex fabric, Glide Dental Floss, as a modern business that actively uses the rule of 150.
Gore is known for being really successful and having this very unique, non-hierarchical culture. No official job titles, everyone's an associate. They have sponsors, not bosses. No formal org charts or budgets, collective input on salaries. Their whole philosophy is to be this big, innovative company that somehow manages to act like a small, nimble, entrepreneurial startup.
So how do they manage thousands of employees effectively with that kind of flat, informal structure?
Well, according to the sources, one of their key organizational principles is deliberately structuring their operations into individual plants and work units that are capped at around 150 people. They found through experience that in groups below that size, informal personal relationships and peer pressure are way more effective at managing workflow, ensuring quality, and fostering innovation than traditional top-down management.
So peer pressure is actually more powerful than having a boss breathing down your neck.
That's what the people working there say. Jim Buckley, a Gore associate, is quoted as saying, "The peer pressure to pull your weight, to be efficient, to contribute, is unbelievable and much more powerful than a concept of a boss." In these smaller units, everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows what everyone else is doing. It leads to this shared scrutiny and sense of collective responsibility. They found that once a plant got much bigger than 150, that crucial informal social control started to break down.
This ties into that concept of transactive memory too, right?
It does, yeah. The psychologist Daniel Wegner came up with this idea. Transactive memory is about how memory isn't just stored inside our individual heads. We also stored it externally, like in a phone book or an atlas, and crucially, we distribute it among people in close relationships. You implicitly count on your spouse or your close colleague to remember certain kinds of information, while they count on you for others.
Like they know where the car keys always end up and you know the Wi-Fi password.
Exactly. Close relationships naturally form this shared, implicit, transactive memory system. You know who's the expert on what, who's responsible for remembering which details. This shared cognitive system is a huge part of what makes small, close-knit groups, like a Hutterite colony or a 150-person Gore plant, function so effectively and cohesively. Building relationships isn't just about sharing feelings. It's also about creating this efficient, shared memory bank.
Okay, so we've got these three fundamental rules. The law of the few, connectors, mavens, salesmen, the stickiness factor, making the message memorable and actionable, and the power of context, how the environment, situation, and group size matter. How do these rules work together in the real world to make something tip?
Well, the sources discuss how these rules help explain really complex processes, like how innovations spread. There's this famous challenge called crossing the chasm, the difficulty of getting a new idea or product to move beyond a small group of early adopters and innovators into the mainstream market.
Right. It's notoriously hard to get something from the bleeding edge into the hands of the average person.
It really is. And according to this tipping point framework, the connectors, mavens, and salesmen are the absolute key to bridging that chasm. They act as what the sources call translators. They take ideas or styles or products that might originate in a very specialized subculture where they might have a very specific meaning or be expressed in jargon or only appeal to a narrow group, and they translate them. They repackage them into a language, a format, a context that the rest of us, the mainstream, can understand, accept, and eventually adopt.
The Airwalk Shoe Company example sounds like a perfect case study of this translation process.
It really does. Airwalk started out deeply embedded in the skateboarding world, a niche brand doing maybe $13 million a year in the early 90s. They had this small, super loyal audience of skaters, but they wanted to grow like way beyond that niche.
So what was their strategy?
They hired this advertising agency, Lambesis, that was apparently very smart about this stuff. Lambesis, especially their head of market research, Dee Gordon, who the sources paint as a real maven for finding cool, specialized in going out and identifying emerging trends right at the source within these innovator youth subcultures. They'd immerse themselves, observe what the really wired kids were doing, wearing, listening to, like noticing white kids in LA starting to adopt the style of Mexican gangsters, wearing those wife-beater undershirts as tops.
Okay, so they found the raw ideas in the subcultures, but just copying them wouldn't work for the mainstream, right?
Exactly. That was just step one. Lambesis didn't just passively report back what they saw. They actively translated and amplified these trends for a broader audience. Dee Gordon noted that for a trend to really cross over, you need cues popping up everywhere in music, in film, in art, in fashion. So Lambesis would strategically plant these translated ideas across different media. And, crucially, they tweak them. They adapt them to make them palatable, understandable, appealing to the mainstream.
Can you give an example of that kind of tweaking or translation?
Sure. Okay, one example. They saw some innovator kids showing an interest in the Dalai Lama. A bit esoteric for a mass market shoe ad, right?
Yeah.
So Lambesis translated it by putting a Tibetan monk in a funny, slightly irreverent ad. It captured the spirit but made it accessible. Another one. Innovator kids had this kind of ironic fascination with preppy country club culture. Lambesis translated that by designing an Airwalk shoe that looked like a yellow tennis ball. It took the core idea, but made it less arch or insidery, more broadly funny and visually striking. They did similar things, merging influences like kung fu movies with youth culture in ways that felt like parody, not just imitation.
So they were taking the spark, the original idea from the subculture, but then deliberately reshaping it, reframing it, to fit the mainstream audience's sense of humor, their understanding, their context.
Exactly. Reshaping it, translating it, twisting it, as the source puts it, to fit the structure of feeling and thought of the broader culture. It's a bit like how rumors naturally change and get simplified or distorted as they spread from person to person, as described by the psychologist Allport. This active translation process carried out by connectors, mavens, and salesmen, or agencies acting like them, is absolutely vital for ideas to make that leap from a small group to become a widespread phenomenon.
This framework seems incredibly versatile. You could apply it to almost any social trend or behavior.
It really is. And the sources use the example of teenage smoking as a really complex, persistent social problem that becomes clearer when you analyze it through this tipping point lens.
Teenage smoking, we usually think about that in terms of addiction, peer pressure, maybe rebellion. How does the tipping point framework apply?
Well, first, the law of the few is clearly operating. Experimenting with cigarettes is highly contagious among teenagers. It spreads primarily through direct contact with other teens, friends, older siblings, and especially certain key individuals the sources call permission givers. These are often slightly older or cooler figures within the peer group, like the examples mentioned, Maggie the au pair or Pam P, who introduce younger kids to smoking and make it seem acceptable or even desirable.
So the initial spread depends on contact with these influential peers, the connectors and salesmen of the teen world.
Right. But here's a really crucial distinction the sources make. The main problem isn't necessarily the experimentation itself. Loads of teenagers try cigarettes once or twice and just stop. Only about a third actually go on to become regular smokers. The urge to experiment with risky things is actually pretty normal for adolescents. Look at the stats for something like cocaine. Many more teens try it than become regular users. The real issue with smoking is that for a significant chunk of those who experiment, the habit sticks.
Ah, so it comes back to the stickiness factor again. Why does it stick for some kids and not others?
That's the million-dollar question. And the sources point out that even among people who smoke regularly, there's huge variation in how sticky the habit actually is. They introduced this fascinating group called chippers, people who smoke consistently, maybe a few cigarettes a day, but aren't truly addicted. They can stop easily, they don't get severe withdrawal. Chippers are proof that nicotine addiction isn't automatic. It's only addictive for some people, some of the time, under certain conditions.
Okay, if stickiness varies so much and isn't guaranteed just by trying it, how does that change how we think about preventing teen smoking?
Well, it helps explain why a lot of traditional anti-smoking campaigns, the ones focusing only on the long-term health risks, you'll get wrinkles, you'll get cancer, you'll die, are often surprisingly ineffective, especially with teenagers. Why? Because teens often already overestimate the risks. Plus, those messages can easily backfire. They come across as adult propaganda, and smoking becomes precisely because adults disapprove a form of rebellion. Trying to stop the peer salesman or just lecturing kids about dangers doesn't seem to be the most effective route.
So if fighting the peer-to-peer spread is tough and the risk messages aren't very sticky for this audience, where else can you intervene using this framework?
This is where the power of context comes in, specifically the idea of internal context. The sources highlight some really surprising research that found a powerful link between smoking and depression. Studies consistently showed higher rates of major depression among smokers. And crucially, smokers who were also depressed found it significantly harder to quit than non-depressed smokers.
So a person's underlying mental health acts as a contextual factor that influences how sticky the smoking habit becomes for them.
Exactly. And this connection was dramatically illustrated by the accidental discovery related to the antidepressant drug bupropion. Researchers at Wellcome found, pretty much by chance, that their drug, designed to treat depression, also seemed to help people quit smoking. Patients reported less desire to smoke, said cigarettes tasted bad. It turned out bupropion acts as a nicotine antagonist in the brain, effectively making the habit less sticky. And this discovery happened even before the strong link between depression and smoking stickiness was fully understood.
Wow. So treating the underlying context, the depression actually made the behavior itself less sticky.
Yes. And this suggests a totally different intervention strategy. Instead of focusing solely on preventing the initial experimentation, which seems almost inevitable for some teens exploring risky behaviors, maybe a more effective approach is to focus on reducing the chances of the habit sticking once experimentation occurs. This could mean addressing underlying issues like depression more effectively. Or, hypothetically, maybe even finding ways to adjust an individual's biological context, like developing a safe way to lower nicotine tolerance to the level of a chipper, making the physical addiction less likely to take hold.
It's about manipulating the context, internal or external, to make the behavior less sticky, rather than just trying to suppress the initial act or scare people away from it.
And the sources draw this really striking parallel between teenage smoking, analyzed this way, and the Micronesian suicide epidemic that's also discussed. Both are presented as these contagious, almost ritualistic behaviors. They often get triggered by seemingly minor incidents. They're heavily influenced by permission givers within the peer group, and they seem to function partly as a form of expressive communication within that specific social context. Research like David Phillips' work on suicide contagion, showing how media reports of suicides lead to measurable increases in subsequent suicides and even oddly specific types of fatal car crashes, reinforces this idea that these complex, deeply personal acts can still spread and behave like social epidemics, profoundly shaped by context and these diffusion dynamics.
It's a really powerful lens. It takes these complex social issues out of just being about individual choices or flaws and puts them into this broader system of influences.
It truly is. It gives you a framework, a way of thinking about why some things tip, why ideas, products, behaviors somehow manage to catch on and spread like wildfire through a population, while other things, maybe things that seem just as good or important, just don't.
So let's try to wrap this up. The core idea from this deep dive into the tipping point material is that big changes often come from little things behaving like social epidemics. And these epidemics seem to follow three basic rules.
Right. First, the law of the few. A small number of specific types of people, connectors, mavens, salesmen, are disproportionately important in spreading the word.
Second, the stickiness factor. The message or idea itself has to be memorable, impactful, and crucially actionable. It has to stick in people's minds and motivate them.
And third, The power of context.
Yeah.
Epidemics are super sensitive to the environment, the circumstances, even things like group size thresholds. Small changes in context can lead to massive changes in outcome.
And a key insight that runs through all the examples is that success, whether you're trying to start an epidemic or stop one, often comes from focusing on these less obvious factors, making subtle shifts, like changing the order of clues in a kid's show, or cleaning up graffiti to change the environmental signals, or recognizing the huge impact of just being in a hurry, or understanding the critical threshold of that group size around 150.
It's often not about brute force. It's about finding those subtle leverage points within these three areas.
So why does understanding all this matter to you, listening right now? Well, hopefully it gives you a kind of shortcut, a different toolkit, maybe a new lens to understand the social trends you see, those unexpected shifts in culture or behavior, even everyday things that might seem baffling otherwise.
Yeah, it definitely challenges some of our gut feelings about how things work, especially our tendency to think in straight lines, big cause, big effect, and that fundamental attribution error, our deep-seated habit of explaining behavior by saying that's just who they are, while ignoring how much the situation might be shaping them.
Knowing these concepts like the law of the few, stickiness, context, it just gives you a more nuanced way to look at the world, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It suggests that if you want to make a change happen, start a positive trend, curb a negative one, build a stronger team, or even just understand why things unfold the way they do, you might get a lot further by focusing on finding the right people, crafting a truly sticky message, or carefully adjusting the context rather than just pushing harder with the same old approach or trying to fundamentally change people's core personalities.
Which brings us to a final thought, something provocative for you to chew on. This whole deep dive into the tipping point really shines a light on that fundamental attribution error. We seem hardwired to see behavior as flowing directly from someone's inner character, their fixed disposition. But the power of context, backed up by studies like the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Good Samaritan study, it strongly suggests that the situation, the environment, the circumstances, sometimes really subtle ones, can often matter more than we think. Maybe even more than inherent personality or deeply held beliefs in shaping what people actually do.
So, the question to leave you with is this. How does really taking that perspective seriously? The idea that situation often drives behavior more than character change how you think. How you think about the people around you, about the causes of social problems like crime or poverty, about why some people succeed and others struggle. Does it suggest that maybe, if we want to improve the world, we should focus less on trying to change individuals and more on changing the environments, the systems, the contexts within which people live and act?
Something to think about. Until our next deep dive.